So, welcome back. Digital trade. Luca came and gave me cards, which I thought was fantastic, and then I realised I wrote these. Age of Fragmentation. I think of this as singularly the most important topic of the day and of the moment. And we're a little lucky here. You'll see I've reversed the panel around. In difference and deference to everything that's come before this, we've got a much broader range of perspectives, experiences, and expertise coming to the stage because of just how broad digital trade is. I know we started with AI. I know it's of the moment. I think we're all asking these questions of how important this really is, how different this is, what the impact's going to be. But we've been trying to get this digital trade piece right, this digital economy / digital trade equation right for some time. And if we don't get this right, as governments rush to regulate all of this stuff right now, we really risk undermining the basis and the fundamentals from which we can grow our economy. And at the time of the need for recovery and resilience, we know that digital is the enabling piece. We know that digital is the thing that's going to drive much of the pushback and the return to economic growth. For the last decade, trade in goods has been going down. Trade in services has largely flattened. All of the growth we've been experiencing pre-pandemic was driven mostly by data and digital trade. And yet, we don't have rules for this stuff. And we have an amazing potpourri of different regulations across our markets, our regions, our economies that threaten to not only constrain, but in many cases break a lot of the digital trade opportunities and our digital economy growth. So it's fundamental to get this right. There are 3 or 4 questions that the contestants today we're going to take you through and attempt to address in a very short period of time. One is the issues and excitement around these digital trade agreements that we see coming out right now. And we have one contestant who is literally helping form some of these. One of those areas is what the opportunities to be landed from digital trade and digital economy growth. What our economies stand to benefit from if we get those digital trade pieces right. And we have 2 contestants who specialise in much of this, one from the private sector, one from the public sector. And then there's the issues around how do we manage to drive inclusion and opportunity across those economies. And of course, the 4th area is where we started the day, AI, artificial intelligence, and the flavour of the moment, generative artificial intelligence, which is still a small subset of all that artificial intelligence offers to drive forward for us, and whether that actually changes these equations too much, keeping in mind how important the trade in digital or the trade in data stands to be. Does AI really fundamentally change the rules of that game? And so let me start by giving a very quick introduction. I'm going to walk down the panel from backwards to front, starting with Miranda Dabi. Miranda is the head of the International Development Strategy Department of Business and Trade UK. I'm going to ask each of the contestants, as my colleague William did this morning, to give a brief introduction to their thoughts around some of this topic because they come from such diverse backgrounds. And then we'll start going into a little bit of a discussion around some of these areas. So Miranda, you get to kick us off, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. Hi, everyone. My name is Miranda Dabi. I work in the Department for Business and Trade as the team leader for international development strategy. So what that means is, how do we ensure that trade and investment objectives are reflected in the way that we, as the UK, undertake development assistance? Now, I'm very pleased to be on this panel. I will preface it by saying, in my work, I look at developing countries, so we look at aid recipient countries. So what I will say will be in the in that remit specifically. Although, of course, there is the discussion between emerging markets, what are they, developing countries, and so on. I will refer to developing countries mostly in what I say. A few words about my angle. Obviously, many of you here know a lot more about digital trade policy than me, but there's a few fundamental principles that we as the UK want to see across everything that we do on digital policy. We want to be a digital policy leader. in digital trade with a network of international agreements, and we can talk about that. But there's 5 key principles that we want to see across everything that we do, be it bilateral, regional, or multilateral work. So I'll recite these. You might recognize them from the G7 trade principles, digital trade principles, which we agreed under our auspices 2 years ago. Open digital markets, that's one of our key objectives. So we're looking at market access, but also non-tariff barriers that relate to digital trade. Data free flow with trust, so we're looking at open cross-border data flows, avoiding unjustified localization, and so on. Safeguards for workers and consumers, another key principles of what we do, roaming, spam, things like that. Digital trading systems, so removing red tape, ensuring that administrative processes are sped up, customs, everything that has to do with that. And finally, and most importantly, and this is I think what I'll focus on most, is a fair and inclusive governance system for digital trade. So shaping regulation standards and interoperability. Now specifically for emerging markets / developing countries, we think fair, inclusive trade is a key engine of transformation. And when we think of digital trade, we see some amazing opportunities, both in terms of economic and inclusion of populations, and they actually go hand in hand. It's a really interesting discussion earlier on, and Pamela made that point very strongly. But also we see some significant challenges that start in the physical realm of infrastructure. But then we go into regulations, and then we go into hurdles in terms of disparities in access, and then security issues and so on. So my final point being our offer in terms of how we support developing countries access the digital supply chain and become really strong actors in it, is a whole system approach to tackling all these issues. I think maybe the most important element is making sure that developing countries are part of the rulemaking process. That is at the core of what we do, and I can speak more about it through technical assistance, how we use our development budget in terms of capacity building, but also we're looking at infrastructure investment, financing tools, and very importantly from a business and trade perspective, the role of the private sector, which I think cannot be underestimated in achieving our objectives.
Thank you very much. I want to come back, as you know, to that, the way the UK is looking at that relationship between trade and aid and capacity building in this area. But humour me, if you will, for one moment. That focus you identified there of issues around data localisation. What do you see as the constraints that data localisation brings to digital economy development, digital trade, opportunities, and then as we move into data-centric, data-driven economies?
Yeah, so we think we want to avoid unjustified data localization. We think it's a big impediment. You're already laughing. We think it's a big impediment to free data flows. So it is part of what we do, both in terms of free trade agreements, and you may have heard of the ones we have, the digital agreement with Singapore. We have, we think, very strong digital chapters with Australia, New Zealand, Japan. But then also in terms of how we support developing countries in negotiating their own position multilaterally, and that is particularly at the WTO, and there we're looking especially at the JSI, but also other important tools like the moratorium on customs duties.
So one of the reasons I was thrilled when Samantha brought Miranda onto the panel was that the digital trade chapters with, for example, Australia and Singapore that she talks about, we helped construct the Singapore-Australia Digital Economy Agreement with the new parts of that, the MOUs, that were put into the appendix of that agreement because the private sector participation was seen as so fundamental to driving the success of these new digital trade agreements that I was thrilled that we had someone who was going to be able to come in and refer to some of that. And Talla in a minute will talk to you more about the way these agreements are getting engineered. But Miranda called out the importance of the private sector relationship and partnerships there. So with that, I'm going to again subvert the rules and move straight across to the female part of the panel again. Danielle Julian Moore, who is the Director of Global Public Policy and Salesforce, brings to the panel the private sector contribution. So, Danielle?
Yes, I'm the regulatory one. Yeah, my name is Danielle Gilliamore. I am the Director of Global Public Policy at Salesforce, and so my job is to ensure that Salesforce has a set of clear and consistent policy positions on a range of topics, including artificial intelligence these days, but it's not limited to just to that. It's privacy, cybersecurity, it's a bit of everything. So my role, which I arrived at after being a lobbyist, and then I used to be a congressional staffer, I've been really pleased to work cross-functionally, government affairs, but also work with our ethics team, our engineering team, to really advocate to governments how they should be looking at the issues that are that underpin a really thriving digital economy that we all find ourselves in these days. So to give you a bit more about Salesforce, although apparently I don't have to say very much about Salesforce because apparently everyone knows Salesforce. We are a customer relationship management software company. We were founded in 1999. And data is a lot of what we do these days. We have about 150,000 customers, and we are processing about 100 billion records. And we are also making about 200 billion AI predictions, I think, each year. So with that said, again, data is really important to what we do, and I think that our company is really an indicator, but also helps underpin a lot of the digital economy. Because of the breadth of customers that we have, we're not limited to just one industry. So what we are really doing is trying to help companies really evolve post-pandemic to help upskill their labor force, to drive efficiencies with their interaction with their customers. So again, digital trade is incredibly important to our company because we really view that as the way in which we're able to do business.
So Luca told me I wasn't allowed to open this up till the hour mark or something, the 45-minute mark, and I'm not really good at obeying rules, as he knows. I'd prefer this was interactive. Just to set the scene, given where Danielle comes from, anyone doesn't know Salesforce? Anyone wants Salesforce explained to them? She's got a great little pitch for, I got it in the corridor.
I do. Trust is our #1 value. So we are here to make sure that you trust us with your most closely held data. We're a great company.
Pass the advertisement. Okay. With that, let me move to Talla. Adatola Oniyami is the digital trade advisor for the AFCFTA Digital Trade Protocol and is also the CEO of Norbase. Talla.
Hi, everyone. My name is Talla. I get to go after all the cool things that have been said, so that's good. Background, I previously used to be Assistant Chief Negotiator for Nigeria. That meant that I worked on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I'll take a lead from him. Who knows what the AFCFTA is? Okay, yeah, all right, great. So the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is an agreement that tries to make Africa a single market for trade and services. So basically it's 54 African countries negotiating together to kind of come up with one single agreement on trade. So I led that negotiations for that. Now I'm leading negotiations and supporting the AFCFTA Secretariat on the digital trade protocol that has been designed. That's supposed to help ensure that as a continent, again, we have one single protocol for digital trade. And I love what someone asked me during the lunch break, and his question to me was, why would you want to have that? 54 different countries, it's like plot chaotic, right? Right, it's like one person, and I'm looking at him right now, it's like one person is more developed than the other. Why would you want to have similar rules, right? And I think this segues into something that I work on a lot. So I run a tech company also, which is supposed to help you set up a business in every African country from one portal. Now, where all this gets interesting is this. So think of it this way. Think that you're a business person, right? Right? And you want to do business on the African continent. You want to do business in Kenya. And the reason I laughed when she said data localization is I have a running bet that I just won, by the way, with someone who's watching, that when you have a digital trade panel, it takes nothing more than 20 minutes for data localization to come up. And she did it, so thanks. You helped me win my bet.
Peter did it first.
But the point is, imagine you're trying to do business in Kenya, right? You're a smart business person, you want to do business in Kenya. You built this fantastic portal that helps farmers do things in Kenya, right? Or helps small businesses send things across the continent. Fantastic business. And you're told you need to figure out the data localization of the farmers. You need to figure out payments across the continent. You need to figure out, and now you're trying to build a Pan-African business. You're trying to ensure that the 1.2 billion Africans that have a $3 trillion economy, which by the way is just 3% of global GDP, can do more within trade. There are all these orders you start to face on a day-to-day basis just because you want to do business. The big question is this: if I was a global business person, I have to pick between the US, which is now a $26 trillion economy, 25% of global GDP, China, which is 19 trillion, which is what, another 20% of global GDP, and all of Africa, which is 3% of global GDP. Now, that 1.2 billion Africans are split between 54 different countries. So the question I ask myself is, so you now got to take it to what's the size of each of those markets? Nigeria is the biggest market on the continent, right? 500 billion, right? You got South Africa, also under 500 billion. Egypt, Kenya. So the question is, why would I have to deal with all this mismatch of rules to do trade across 54 countries? Why can't I just go to the US and have 25 trillion?
Have you tried working in Alabama? Different rules.
I agree with you. So, and that's really what the digital trade protocol is trying to surmount. It's basically trying to say, can we rethink what the digital economy can look like? Can we agree on common standards? Yes, you might be a country that's made progress with data localization or progress with data protection or progress with consumer rules, but are there things we can at least agree on first? And then try to figure out how we can make there be a single digital economy for the continent. And why does that matter? It matters because in the absence of rules, Pan-African rules, regional rules, the only people who thrive in doing business are big businesses. Case point, right? And that's important. The reason is a big business has the funding to show up in a capital and go meet a minister or an head of government and say, this is the rules that matter to me. If you're a small trader in Burundi, you don't have that kind of access. But you also still want to sell your farm produce. You want to sell it across the continent. What things like the digital trade protocol allow you to do is create standards that are important and centralized so that I can actually access the markets that look impossible and out of reach for me. And that's why the digital trade protocol matters. And I say that I think that it's probably the most important single piece of instrument that the African continent can negotiate to deliver real prosperity in real time for the continent. And that's what I want to spend the time talking about today.
So there's two really important points among a host of others that Talla raises with that last thing. Yes, it's the big guys who can come into a city or a country and immediately get to work. But the big guys like Salesforce, like Google, bring their partner ecosystems, and the only reason they survive and thrive is those partner ecosystems. The SMEs, and the SMEs need to be able to do, as Talla says, and work globally, regionally certainly, work in multiple countries and get past these barriers to participation and market access. The question I have right now still is, which of these have we got right? Which of these have we cemented in place? Which of these are we benefiting from? And which are going to change with artificial intelligence and these new digital developments that are coming through? So you have on the stage, and please don't feel like you need to wait until I call Q&A and open it up to you. This is the friendly end. There's drinks after this, right? Except for the live streaming people who have to do the pandemic thing and toast. We are relaxing into the drinks hour. Because what you have here is you have a negotiator, you have a developer, and you have a user at the private sector end of the scale. They are all working on making these rules work. Why have we got data localization so wrong? I'm going to hammer home on this one, because as we go into artificial intelligence world and a data-centric world, it seems to me our industry got this appallingly wrong. We went out there saying cross-border data flows, good. Data free flow with trust, good. Data localization, bad. And we went very arrogantly at ministers and regulators. We said they were lazy, as came out this morning. We said they didn't know their job and these were dumb regulations and the economy would fall in. And it didn't do that. They learnt they could put data localization and data sovereignty in place and the economy didn't collapse. And so now we've got all of these regulations cross-cutting coming back. We have to get smarter on this. So how do we start getting that piece right? You're negotiating this.
So I'll jump in straight, and it puts me on the spot. But I'll say this, and I think I like the context that you set, which is that one of the mistakes we made was lead with an agenda, which was say, data localization is bad, this is good, right? And what kind of happened was, we put governments in a very complex place, particularly developing governments, right? Because what we did for years was tell them, the future is tech. The future is digital trade. You could make a lot of prosperity from this. You could lift your countries out of wealth. But the server is going to be in London. And that matters because, this big tech company is based there and it's easier for us to do it in Germany and it's more reliable light. And they're saying, if you say that's going to create a lot of jobs, why is it not here? Yep. And then the way we should have approached it was to engage and explain context. But what we did was say, no, you're wrong. You don't understand this enough. And they're like, hey, I actually schooled in the UK, so you're not going to tell me that, right? And then all that happened. And then they put the things in place. We had this mismatch where almost every country has a data localization rule. Government, private sector have had to navigate around that, even though it means putting one server that nobody uses in the country and claiming that that's the server and all those kind of interesting things. What are we trying to do differently? One is actually allow more engagement between private sector and the government. And I think, no shade to the people who put this together, but I think one of the biggest problems was the role of lobbyists, right? Because what happens is lobbyists are told, you need to sell this story. And the way they do it is engage the governments and try to convince them. What is an easier approach is just put the government and the private sector in the same room and let them talk and step out. And I'll tell you an example of it, right? We had this event in Togo, Lome, right? Where we got the American Chamber of Commerce and the people doing the digital trade protocol to be in the room. And of course, everyone comes gun blazing. We're going to do data localization. We want all the servers in our countries. It's important, And then Google starts to say, we don't disagree. We spend X amount of money in your continent on this and this and this. We have this number of servers in the country. Microsoft says the same thing. This person says the same thing. And suddenly what comes past is, they actually spend a lot of money on the continent. Now the minister is surprised. You're spending that much on the continent? And they're like, yes, we've got a server here, we've got a server here, we've got a server here. Now everyone is not being defensive, everyone is actually having a conversation. And they're saying, the reason why we can't put this many servers in different countries is because what you actually start to experience is, I can't move data between all of you, or I have to keep the same data 7 times or 12 times, and it just doesn't make sense. What if we went about it this way? And suddenly it moved from a push-pull to actually a conversation. And what's interesting was this. We leave the meeting and we have the same the next negotiation, like I think a few weeks after. And the same member states that have been for the longest times pushing and saying, we want data localization laws, start to say, actually, we want to have a mechanism for data sharing across the continent. What? Why? We put the private sector and the government in the same room. And that's just more of what needs to happen. More actual engagement without the fences, without the pretense, without the agendas, just people actually having conversations. And one thing I find very easy in negotiations is having people put their interests out first. I'm a business person, I want to not have to spend money on 54 servers. And you say, I want business. So let's talk. All the interests are out. Let's have a conversation. How do you ensure that business stays in your country? And how do I ensure that I don't have to do 54 servers? And there's an answer to navigate for that way to get to those kind of answers. But the answer starts with everyone putting their cards on the table and having honest conversations in rooms and engaging. And that's kind of what we're trying to have. We're trying to have a lot more of those kind of events happen. We're trying to ensure that the business people that can talk to the government are there. And the reason is important. In the end, governments have a sovereign right to regulate and a sovereign right to make legislations. And if you don't spend time engaging the government, and not in we're trying to convince you, but laying the cards on the table and saying this is why what matters, what happens is they come defensive, everyone is playing an agenda, and then we don't get anything done. And no shade, right? There's several digital trade protocols that have just not been implemented. Because what will happen is you can lobby it and get the agreement passed, but no one is going to be able to implement it because in the end, states will not adopt it. And so we got to think about a long-term approach. So for instance, one of the things we've been able to say to member states these days is, what's the reason why you wouldn't do it? And an example is things like document authentication. right? One of the things in the digital trade protocol for the African continent is you cannot discriminate against a document only on the basis that it's an electronic document. Now, the one thing governments start to ask is, I like paper because I can authenticate where it comes from. I can see a stamp. I can see a signature. How do I do that, right? And then someone says, oh, do I have to trust a document like DocuSign? Or do I trust this? How do I know? They're outside the continent. Would they give me access to protocols? What's interesting is, can I get them in the same room and have conversations? What do you need to be able to authenticate properly?
Can you see why he likes negotiating and being the negotiator? I'm struggling with why he has a problem with lobbyists. Miranda, it's going to move to the private sector, which I want to get back to. But Talla raises a good point about this not being about tech. It's about how it benefits our economy and the use cases that come through, which is where the talk needs to be far more about. Talk to us about the capacity building and the technical assistance that really form the heart of where we're now moving with a lot of these trade agreement follow-throughs, because it's really about helping the SMEs and getting them to participate in the broader economic opportunity.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, I really like what you said about involving business in not just how we implement trade agreements, but how we negotiate trade agreements. So I think a really important thing, and one that we as a quite new department that negotiated trade agreements for the first time set up right after we left the EU, had to learn was a protocol of how to engage private sector throughout the negotiation cycle and not just at the end when you implement something and you find out it's not what business wanted. So I fully agree with you, and I think the insights we got from business under all kinds of frameworks. We had open discussions, we had discussions under confidentiality arrangements with both large companies and SMEs, business representative organizations, but also trade unions, civil society. We're accompanying negotiations at all times. And I think this is the key element of making sure that we tailor our positions according to the end users. And the way I like to, I don't know if this is the right terminology, but I like to think of the end users as the customers of what we do. So the trade agreement needs to work, but then also, importantly, it needs to be quite agile and iterative afterwards. So one of the things that I find really interesting about our new trade agreements is the Australia one, for instance, has an innovation chapter. And what it looks at is what are the systems and the structures that we set in place to make sure that an FTA training arrangement remains up to date and can keep up with emerging technologies, can keep up with new developments. And that's really important that you, rather than one single binding line, you keep yourself in check regularly with your partners. So I fully agree with the role of business. In terms of your question with, capacity building. So, as I said, one of our main objectives in terms of how we support developing countries to become strong actors in digital trade is by ensuring that they're part of the rulemaking process. And our technical assistance that we provide through aid money spreads across a range of different activities. It's before we even get to the point of negotiating within the WTO, for instance, it is WTO accession. So we would support governments on that, but then also build capacity on negotiations, build capacity on best practice of how to engage business, for instance, and then build capacity on how to represent your interest strongly in these negotiations. So you don't have to rely on a global north perspective, on a G7 principles, which we of course think are good. And we want to see, as I said, in everything that we do, but we also think it's equally important that our negotiating positions take developing countries into account, and that they then have a strong voice themselves and the ability to engage most effectively with these negotiations. So our capacity building accompanies this process of engaging in negotiations rather than replacing something.
So we had to put a roadshow on when the UK-Australia agreement was coming into play, not least because the question comes up, we've done this for SMEs primarily, and we've done this for our trade opportunity. What we're getting back from SMEs is, this is a friggin' FTA. What benefit is this to me? How do I benefit from this thing? to the points that are getting raised, the authentication of documents, the recognition of identity, the payments facilitation piece, the trade facilitation that makes so much of what they're otherwise going to have to register for, follow through on, prosecute, gets taken away. And from the questions this morning about the productivity benefits that AI stands to bring, you're basically going in there and running a workshop on how an SME can have a one-stop shop that says, now I can focus on my business in another country like I'm doing here and apply the same sort of rules for it. And you're trying to get that taken on board. You and I argued last night about how we pull this through and how we recognise the importance of digital trade. But the private sector appreciation and pulling this through into our partner networks is fundamentally important. What is it we need to be recognising here so that the SMEs are seeing why the benefits are and how we make sure that, to Talla's point that I'm going to keep coming back to, how governments start aligning on the rules and regulations they're putting in place from these agreements?
Yeah, I think there's a really complicated way of answering that, but I'm going to try to go, I think, more simple.
I was relatively drunk last night, so do the simple version.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to really do the simple version here. You know, I think when we talk to our SMEs, when we talk to the Salesforce ecosystem, data is so much of what we talk about. And so when we're talking about FTAs, back when I was in DC and talking about USMCA, a lot of what we were concerned about was cross-border data flows, because in order for us to create this platform for SMEs to build their businesses off of, they need to be able to have confidence that data is being protected and respected and processed in line with the values in the markets that they're looking to be active in. And that's not just the US or EU. It's now an ever expanding list of countries, because, you know, I know you said at the top that trade and services has kind of plateaued, but at the same time, I do think people are now expecting to be able to have a little bit of home delivered to them wherever they are. You know, I mean, I expect to be able to get US goods even though I live in London. And so when we have an economy and individuals that are saying that, I think the important thing for larger companies to say to them, to both sides, not just SMEs, but to governments alike, is that there is a need to have clear and consistent rules that are based on values that I frankly think we all share. I think no matter what country you live in, privacy is important. However, how you decide to protect privacy might be a bit different. However, we all acknowledge that security and privacy and content that is put on some of these platforms should all be protected and respected. So as I talk to SMEs or our partners, you know, I'm saying to them, you know, let's go to government. Let's talk about how cross-border data flows or how the lack of a privacy law is impacting your business. And then to governments, I'm talking about how SMEs are having a harder time because there might not be a privacy law, or because there is friction between two different governments about their approach on privacy, and is not allowing for prevailing rules and norms and best practices to be respected between the two countries. And so I think sometimes that frankly erodes the ability for companies, it's large and small, to comfortably operate around the world.
Have they convinced you? Have they won you over on the importance of this? If this is the biggest part of our global economy and our global growth, if this is the bigger opportunity for economic recovery and resilience moving forward, how is it that as the UK, Australia, Canada, the US, Europe, Africa, all come up with these agreements, we don't know what the value of this digital trade is, and we don't know what the value of these agreements is. In every single one of these countries or regions, one by one, these trade negotiators, these practitioners are getting hauled up before Parliament, before Senate, and now challenged. They've got teams of people who are trying to implement, negotiate this stuff. They've got massive investments they're spending on folk like us, the consultants and the damn lawyers who come into the room, who help the road shows and explain this to people. There's a lot of money going into this, and parliaments and senates are saying, where's our return on investment? If this is so important, show us the importance. And you've had countries like Australia who turn around and get demanded to say, and I hate going back to the damn data localization bit again, but you put data localization in these agreements. Have we seen a mitigation of these? So if this is so important, are they selling you on this? How come we can't capture this? Go for it.
Well, I think it's difficult because I think we've had a lot of mission creep, and you can see mission creep across several different pieces of regulation globally. I think what we're considering to be national security and of national importance, national security used to, I think, have a very clear definition, and now we look at economic concerns as a part of national security. So when countries are looking at how they want to define data localization, or they want to tier an importance, different types of data that need to be housed in country versus those that can be mirrored, versus the type of data that can flow freely, I think that there is more and more concern that they're allowing data that is really, really important to go elsewhere. I think is one of the concerns I think I would cite from a regulatory standpoint, at least.
So I open this up to you to pick up on before Talla jumps in. Let's start bringing all of this home. What recommendations would you make to the policy leaders to be able to answer this question? What should they be driving forward from your sales force, from your corporate private sector viewpoint? Where do we need to get this right?
Yeah, so I think discussions at the multilateral level around our attitudes towards data are really important, because I think as we've seen products like the AI principles that the OECD put out, it allowed for a certain cushion to be created for countries to then go out and say, okay, this is a definition that has been stress tested by more than several different countries, that the private sector opined on, and it allowed for a more solid bit of agreement to emerge on really thorny issues. I think another good example of a multilateral effort was the government access principles around government access to data principles. I think that was a really thorny issue that a lot of countries were really, really concerned about. And the fact that the OECD sat down and tried to put together a set of principles then allowed countries to have a bit more, to relax, to have, I think, a little bit less concern about what's happening in the technology space. Because I think kind of all talked around the fact that technology is an amazing opportunity, and I think there has been a lot of concern and freak out about the level and the pace of innovation. And so as we now, I think, are starting to get a bit more used to the pace of innovation, I think people are now starting to become a bit more calm about the regulatory challenges presented by innovation, and able to take a more clear-minded approach to regulation. I'm not saying it's always perfect, but I do think that at the multilateral level, you can at least see where there are more level-headed conversations and principles that are being created, and then how you see that those same principles then showing up in regulatory efforts, and that creating a sort of global best practice. So I think there's reason to hope in the space, at least.
She's good, right? She calmed me down last night like this as well. So suddenly I feel like we've suddenly got somewhere. As I was working with my colleague Greg on that wonderful speech you heard this morning, and trying to G him up into saying, actually, we've got to get this right now. Because I'm terrified of this moment. I think as the AI-driven rules and regulations come through, I think that map out that he gave to us that said, one of these countries, we're going to see some bad actors utilize AI for what they want, and then the next thing that's going to happen is people are going to start slamming down in response to what they hear as the call to regulate, and we're going to go overboard because we think this is how you somehow match up safety and security with economic growth, and they'll regulate the way out of this. Your desire to get 54 countries to agree on a set of principles by which SMEs can play out an entire, that seems fundamental to me. And I'm not quite sure we've worked out what we got wrong last time and how to get this right. She's very good at calming me down. I'm worried we haven't learnt our lessons yet at a time where it is so fundamentally important. Tell me I'm wrong.
So I think I'll pick back first on your question before this one, right? Which is the question of why has it been incredibly hard for us to measure digital trade and its impact? And I think it's probably four things, right? I think the first is the word digital trade is very nebulous, right? Like, if anything, so usually, if I say it's goods, you know what that is. It's like, it's like
my car.
Goods, cars, services, kind of clear. The thing digital trade is, it's digital, which is like online. It's a means to an end. And trade, also very broad and nebulous. One of the big questions and arguments that you have in every digital trade negotiation is, what classifies as digital trade here and what does not, right? And because in the end, digital trade is mostly a means to an end, what it ends up happening is, you kind of have, and it happens a lot in the negotiations, where you touch on an issue and someone says, oh, isn't that a trade in services issue? Isn't that a trade in goods issue? Isn't that and that happens all the time. And so that's the first thing, right? It's like, it's so nebulous and fluid in a way. And so there's this whole concern of, where do I start measuring digital trade from? And at what point do I stop measuring?
Let me interrupt him. Because they do this all the time. And I know what he's saying, and I tend to agree. Do you not know what digital trade is? Let me see. Who doesn't know what digital trade is in my audience of digital professionals? You're all doing in this. Who doesn't know what it is? Because we'll explain it to you. So you all do know what it is. Okay.
Is it the enabler of the physical goods, or is it the actual selling of software and things?
It's both. I would say there's
is it both?
It's delivered, and then it's ordered. So it's the. I think it's the.
So it's the mechanism that will help that small SME, in Kenya, sell their goods to other countries.
That's and these conversations, this fundamental question determines whether e-commerce is a conversation within digital trade negotiations or it's not. It covers whether things like postal service and logistics matters or not. That's one of the first things. I think the second thing is, I think we've had a longer time to try and figure out other protocols. So we've had a longer experience with trade, we've had a longer experience with services than, goods and services than we have with digital trade. Before we did the 1993 WTO agreement, we had been doing trade for quite a number of time. Suddenly you've got this fast-moving world where digital comes in, tech comes in, online things come in, and suddenly you want us to create rules for it. And everyone is like, I don't understand it enough, right? I've not had enough practice of what's, for instance, one thing that happens a lot is, and I'll use AI, a great example, right, is, so when I go to capitals and I'm talking to presidents or ministers, one of the questions that comes up a lot is, how do I approach AI, right? And the reason is simple. The biggest AI companies today are in the US or in the UK or Europe, right? I don't have a lot of big digital AI companies in my country. So I don't have anyone to engage to ask all the questions that I want to ask, right? I don't have as much practitioners actually playing around with things. So the question is, but at the same time, you tell me there's benefits. So I don't want to make rules that cuts me out of whatever benefit, but I don't understand it enough to even think about the rules. And that is exactly what it looks like for when people try to make rules around digital trade. Because there's just not enough practice on how to, on what it means for most businesses and most countries. I think the third big issue is we're at that point where some of the biggest benefits of trade, not digital trade now, trade are beginning to show. Now, previously, countries cared more about infrastructure than trade. For the longest time, they cared more about big roads and super highways than trade. And then suddenly, people saw how much an economy could make prosperity by trade. Singapore showed them, right? The US showed them, right? China showed them. So it became an issue of, oh wow, trade matters. So now everyone is coming saying, I want to be part of this trade cake, right? And then now it's, oh, digital trade cake, right? Without understanding the world. And that's the third big part, right? So you have this course where there's almost like a scramble for digital trade. And that's why digital localization confusions are happening. Because everyone is scrambling. Everyone wants to be part of it. right? Because they've seen the last benefits happen, and they weren't part of the last benefits, and now they want to be part of this benefit, but they don't understand it enough. And that's why I think it's hard to measure, because what's happening is you've got this people trying to act like they understand it enough, even when they don't. Now, going to your second question, which is, all the lessons of the last time.
Hold on. Miranda, has he got it right? You've benefited in this world. You're playing in this world. Is this the problem with digital trade?
I actually had a different thought about what you said, which is I feel there's a risk of leapfrogging to the latest hot topic, for instance, AI, but then forgetting other elements crucial to development that enable countries to even at some point reach the point where they can engage in the latest hot topic. So I think whilst there's always trends in development and the coolest thing to do right now, they all need to happen at the same time and they need to be adapted to different countries. So I think one level is having these conversations at the multilateral level, which is very important because that sets hopefully best practice and engages as many countries as possible now. For instance, on the JSI, we have 90 countries engaged. It's not enough, it should be more. Only 4 LDCs, least developed countries. So, but on the ground level, you still need to do the boring stuff. You still need your infrastructure. You still need your very basic infrastructure. You still need very basic primary education, primary healthcare. That is an enabling environment to then lead to digital engagement at some point. And then you need all the aid for trade things that we're doing. So it's a combination of things. I don't think we should just talk about the hottest topic. We should talk about everything that sits behind countries being able to engage properly with the hottest topic.
But if this question's sort of correct, which it resonates for me, isn't digital trade effectively just trade at this point in time? If the enablers and the actual transactions are the whole piece, aren't we now just trying to recognise that digital is enabling the economy?
Yeah.
So of course, we have, you were saying there used to be trade in goods and then trade in services, and now there's digital, but there's digitally delivered services. Mm-hmm. So it's all one. Yeah. It's all one thing.
Which is where the confusion comes in, which I'll get back to, and Talla will come back to this. But we had a story this morning about the Ministry of Transportation and the Ministry of Communications not talking, and so therefore you couldn't roll out roads with, I think H was running this line out, you couldn't run out communications lines, fibre with roads, which was insane. And I thought, well, my experience is the other way around. In India, they rolled out a lot of communications and fibre networks before the roads were put in place. And now the problem was every time that they cut up a road or realised that they had to lay the road properly, they cut the communications line. And the Communications Ministry kept asking the Transportation Ministry where they were going to be digging next, because they didn't want, what we're talking about is that level of coordination, because digital has become the enabler of both economic development and trade, which means we can't forget the lessons, but then it gets complicated to Talla's position because we have to align with our neighbours. And we have to align with our different ministries. If I got Saad back up here, because he was very diplomatic from the bits I caught of the content moderation, the real issue that challenges him and my friends in the other big platforms when we really talk content moderation is how many ministers I have to get in the room, because I heard someone asking about a content economy. I can do comms easily at this point in time. Rob, we've been doing this for 30 years. It's how many content economies do we actually have right now, because we're moderating lots of different, not only types and typologies of content, but cultures and cultural sensitivities as well. So that's where I start getting very complicated across 54 economies. Yeah. How do I get them to agree on these basics so we enable economic growth and resilience?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think the way
I knew I'd get one in finally.
The way we've approached it is to kind of have some sorting order, all right? So when we're engaging, one of the things we tried to do was do a set of stakeholder engagement with all the member states and the private sector groups within them. Two things happened that we found very interesting. One of them is that countries are actually not really great at engaging the private sector in their countries. It was pretty weird, right? Because what happens is that first you trust the country to engage with the private sector group and bring and harvest all their opinions. And that just wasn't happening, right? They were bringing government positions.
Yep.
Right. So what we had to do first was engage the private sector groups in the countries and also try to engage the government, so separate them in each countries. What starts to happen is you start to see a common position on those issues, right? So usually we'll come up with, usually on most issues, there are 3-4 opinions, right? Usually the private sector has a strong opinion on something, or they're indifferent about something. The government either has a strong opinion on something or is indifferent about something. You kind of end up with that. When you put that in more interesting metrics against other countries, you start to have a very interesting mass where a country cares about national security and wants to put a national security clause on every phrase, right? And you have another country who is like, I just want telecoms access all around the continent. And you've got someone else that says things like, oh, I don't care about that. I just want e-commerce access. I want my goods to be able to move in. And so you have this interest. And so one of the things we did was we tried to create a map, right? On an issues-based map. What are the issues that matter to everyone? And what's the issues-based map? Meaning, on the issue of data localization, what's everyone, private sector and public sector on this issue? On the issue of document authentication, where's everybody? On the issue of digital identity, someone wants foundational identities only. Someone wants functional identities. Someone doesn't even want identities at all, right? Map all that out. Now, when you've done that, the question starts to become, what exactly is your strongest opinion on this issue, right? What's great about it is, in some cases, you find that a country doesn't really care about an issue because they don't have an industry there yet. That's great. So you want to figure out the guys who have strong opinions, either for or against, and then try to figure out what exactly can we agree on. So what we did, interestingly, on the protocol, when you see it, is we have a protocol and we're going to have an annex separate from the protocol. And why that's important is we try to ensure that in the protocol, we could put the things that they agreed on and then agree to decide the mechanisms for the rest in the annex. So for instance, on things like digital identity, everyone agreed there should be some kind of rules around digital identity. Fantastic. Now the question is, should it be foundational? Should it be functional? What exactly is functional? What exactly is foundational? Gets more complicated. What exactly? And then you say, okay, can we take all the thorny issues and make them an issue for the annex, right? And then decide what modalities will the annex take. And that's kind of how we've approached it, right? Because you're talking 54 countries, you're talking 54 times 2, because now there's private sector in the 54 countries and public sector. And that's kind of how we've approached it so far. It's worked so far. Another thing that's been interesting is to actually ask people to reduce things to documents. And why that's important is this, and I was making a joke to someone interestingly, is that a number of times you might find out that the problem is not the government, but a person in the government. And that happens a lot, where the government doesn't have a strong position on something, but someone has a personal strong position on something and adopts that as the government position by himself, unilaterally. The beautiful thing when you tell them to reduce it to document and send it is they have to clear with capital that they have the right to put that. And that issue is gone.
Wow, that's like a negotiating tactic.
I shouldn't have disclosed that, huh?
No, I'll take that.
As he loses you on the intricacies of negotiating, that first point of government and private sector don't talk the same language, we think of it like an Australian barbecue. In an Australian barbecue, you walk in and the men go one way and the women all go the other way. It's exactly the same with this kind of crap. The government people all go and sit in one corner and the private sector sit in the other corner, and none of them speak the same language. The important issue here for me is the reason Talla is my superior in every other major, correct me if I'm wrong here, Miranda, with the exception of something like a DEPA, every other major trade agreement that has digital, we put it into a chapter, we put it into an MOU, we put it into an annex. He negotiated one that was a digital agreement for a freaking continent. We keep thinking it's something different, and I think digital trade is trade. And I think we need to start making sure that we pull this stuff through into our fundamental trade.
We do have the UK-Singapore digital trade agreement.
Tell you that. Cheers.
Thank you. I'm going to keep going because I've got a lot of questions for these guys, but questions. You have the experts up here. I get to fade into the background. Questions for these three, given their experience.
So excuse my ignorance, but
You have a streaming audience that's now drinking heavily behind you. You have to wait for the microphone. And you have to announce who you are.
So Nada here, part of Access Partnership. Excuse my ignorance, but I was curious also in terms of budgets or development funds. When you prioritize which products or which areas does the money actually go to in the short and medium and long term? What plays a factor in that decision-making process, if I may ask? Because that obviously trickles down into what is possible and is available in terms of infrastructure to have any of these negotiations to begin with. So,
it's a good question. I mean, we currently have an international development strategy that was agreed last year. It sets out the key principles of what we want to pursue in terms of the different areas of development. And it's a long-term strategy. The actual programming is then done within that. We realize that our aid budget, whilst being generous, is not going to solve all the issues. It's currently 0.51% of GNI. So one of the key, especially for us in the Department for Business and Trade, one of the key elements is how do we use our aid budget strategically to mobilize private investment? And how do we ensure that it is helping businesses then continue the journey for us? In terms of how we set the priorities, it is partially political, of course, but then these strategies are meant to be long-term and kind of outlive the different governments. There was, in my personal opinion, a big change in the UK's development strategy in the last few years. In the last development strategy that we have now, we have a lot more of a focus on economic development, on investment as a tool, different types of investment, so both ODA-backed investment, private investment, concessional. But also, I think it's a bit of a mind shift change in seeing countries as partners and working together on what tools are needed to grow this partnership, rather than what I think people see as more traditional aid. We still do that, but I think the focus has shifted to international development, economic development.
Given that governments are from Mars and private sectors from Venus, how well are they picking up on what private sector needs to see in these agreements?
I mean, I don't want to be the person that says government isn't doing a good job. I actually do think you guys are doing a good job. I think in a lot of sectors, in a lot of corners of this conversation. I mean, I really try not to be binary in this policy world, because so rarely is the answer on any of these policy issues a good or bad, yes or no. It's always a question of nuance. And so I do think that the government, especially I'll say the UK government, it has consultations, meetings, open door policies, the trade principles that you put out, talking about data localization and talking about the building blocks, whether it be cybersecurity, source code, or what have you, to e-commerce chapter, the digital trade chapter, and your viewpoint. So it's not only just listening to us, but also articulating what you think, and then giving us the opportunity to comment on what you've put out. I think you see consultations in the EU, the US, UK. I think a lot of different countries have been doing this, especially on privacy and AI, where they first will put out a paper. I think that is so critically important, and I think it is, maybe I usually would describe myself as a pessimistic person, but I sounded very optimistic today, which is uncharacteristic. But I really do think that a lot of these consultations show that governments are really trying to take into account the viewpoints of private sector, and also understanding that the private sector, with the innovation, they are thinking about how to ethically roll out a lot of this innovation and a lot of the bits and pieces that underpin what we talk about when we talk about digital trade. And so government listening to private sector and actually not thinking the worst of us I think is also good. I mean, I know we're talking about in the earlier panel, self-regulation. I don't think that is an answer, but I just think in this age of innovation, the answer is going to be very many things, and it's going to be a multifaceted answer, and so that's beyond what you asked. But yes, I think it's good, and there's evidence in consultations and the amount of papers that are being put out and meetings.
I think she's saying you're doing so-so. Whenever my daughter says, I know you're trying hard to understand what I said, I know it's a put down. Question over here.
Thank you. My question is directed at Talla. My name is Samantha, and I hosted a session earlier. I wonder if it's a question of proof of concept. You're talking about trying to get agreement. 54 countries, you've already highlighted how difficult that is, but there's regional groups within Africa, for instance. And is it a question of pushing some sort of regional harmonization to actually then demonstrate really what is possible to set the standard for the rest of the continent? So that's one question, and sort of linked to that is, through that proof of concept, you create this larger market. We've already got customs unions, but the potential for digital trade within that, you're talking about, hyperscalers, for instance, locating, cloud service farms or cloud platforms in one country. That's already created a much larger market than looking at, an individual country. And is that possible? Is, for instance, ECOWAS, I lived in Ghana for a little bit, if you're Nigerian, if we put the Google, cloud platform in Ghana, given the sort of friendly competition that there is between Ghana and Nigeria, would Nigerians trust the frameworks and the protections, etc., that are in place in Ghana to manage that regional cloud platform?
Thank you so much. That's a really, really good question. And why I'm smiling a lot is, it almost seems like you're in the room when we're having some conversations. So one of the things there's a proof of concept we're trying to work on. We call that a guided trade initiative, right? One of the proof of concept we're trying to actually push for digital trade is actually on e-commerce. So one of the big arguments is, we've got all these big arguments about what digital trade exactly is, right? And you can talk all you want, but people want to see real results. So one of the big arguments is, if you're a small businessman in Ghana, Burundi, or you're even a big commerce provider, one of the biggest hurdles to e-commerce for you is last mile logistics, the last mile delivery. The people who have the biggest spread historically for last mile is postal services, right? So one of the pilot projects we're running around, and we're trying to do something in East Africa now, and that's actually why I am next week in Mombasa, is to say, can we use the post services as a last mile delivery for e-commerce? Basically build some kind of digital platform on top of it, and then say, you're a trader, you don't have to think about getting things past your next closest postal service, and someone's going to get it passed from there. And so you can focus on within you, because what you see on the continent is, within one country, there's great logistics, but once you start to think cross-border, it's just incredibly broken. And the question is, can we use the postal services, the PAPUs, the Pan-African Postal Union, the East African Postal Union, as a way to do some kind of pilot project about what's possible? So I love that you're saying that, because it means that maybe we're not that crazy after all, right? We're probably saying the right things, right? So it's great, so that's one of the things we're trying to do with guided trade and having some kind of things. The second question you asked, which I think is fundamentally just as important, is the question of the rivalry around the continent and whether there's trust. So what I find is this. I find that, and it's a very random phrase I heard once, right? Where goods cross, guns don't cross, right? And I think what kind of happens is, when economic development starts to get delivered, people actually throw most of those sentiments across the country. And one easy way to say it is this. You can go on Twitter or X now and if you're Ghanaian, you probably can diss Nigerians and they just come back at you. But if you're not Ghanaian and not Nigerian and you diss one of the two countries, they're both going to come together and come at you. And that's just what it is. And so the thing is, in the end, there's a healthy rivalry and there's a lot of tease and that, right? But like in the end, when it gets to the same case, because the thing is, on the continent, our problems are similar, right? Everyone has the same issues around how do we deliver quality education, on the continent, how do we deliver quality housing, how do we deliver prosperity. So our problems are the same. And I think, and you'd see that from how people receive the AFCFTA agreement, right? The AFCFTA agreement, interestingly, was negotiated entirely by African countries at the beginning, in the sense that there was actually almost no foreign aid into the actual first negotiation. It was member states themselves saying, may the late Ambassador Chedo rest in peace, who drove that entire process. It was just member states saying, we want an agreement. And people received it well, because it was, okay, interesting, right? There's a big question around movement of goods. There's this issue of an African passport. There's a lot of conversations happening. They're not all making the same progress. But what you see is that if you draw out very carefully and transparent, I like some of the things she's saying around writing documents and pushing them out there, allowing people to engage and writing comments. If you do a lot of that, for instance, there's something now called it's pushed by Afrexim. This whole idea of saying, can we create a mechanism for ensuring that you can change currency within the continent without having to change it, move it outside the continent. So there's a lot of interesting things happening. And I think the big argument is, yes, those things can fly if you want, provide as much information to private sector and to people about it. And I think that's something governments on the African continent are not really great at, which is providing as much information, allowing people, like, there's a lot of, and it's a tease I say a lot, there's a lot of infantilizing of citizens that happens, where it's like, you don't know enough, this is what we think is best. What you've seen happen is, if you give people the information they need to be able to make quality decisions, and the context for that decisions, and the assumptions based on which decisions are made, I've actually seen over and over again, people engage well. An example is what we've done, what's happened with M-Pesa in Kenya. And now M-Pesa is actually almost an East African thing, because it's not just like in Kenya. And interestingly, what's funny about M-Pesa is there's a massive rivalry in East Africa within Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. But everybody wants M-Pesa because it's worked. It's delivered financial inclusion in Kenya successfully. And now everybody wants the same thing. It's run by Safaricom. They make a lot of money out of it, but everybody wants it because it actually does work.
Great set of answers. The thing he's about to learn about the postal unions and the postal footprint is they're one of the most trusted entities in most countries, and so they work when you get excited about this for e-commerce, because people are happy to go in there and get their money from them and their remittances, and they'll pay it. They have an identity, and they are the least service-oriented institutions on the planet. Trying to turn them into Amazon is not a fun job to go through.
I agree.
But he's going to go through that journey now. But the other point he raises the competition, because you raised Ghana and Nigeria, and back in China at the outset of the telecommunications revolution, they put a secret list together in China amongst the provincial PTTs. And so they said, yes, we're the central government, yes, we will fund, yes, telecommunications is strategically important. And then they published a list of the maturity index of the regional PTTs, and they put the competition out there. It's something we've been trying to argue to ASEAN. If you let people compete, if you let countries compete, they try to get ahead of each other, and then they complain when you put the index out and say, you judged us wrong. We're better than this. We beat Laos. We can come ahead of it.
Yeah.
It works really nicely. It's not something to be afeared of. Other questions we have?
I think UNCTAD has an e-readiness measurement tool that they put out now, which is...
Don't get me started. I'm going to argue with that one. Yes,
We talked about that last night too.
Yes, we did. It's wrong, but I've got to.
I didn't say that.
Great. Onika here again. So I'm finally realizing that I'm one of those old people I used to talk about. A little impatient with our progress. So when I just have a question with regards to the Africa trade. How have we done in terms of inter-trade, Africa trade offline, African countries trading and moving goods with each other? Because I really believe that technology alone is not going to solve it. If we are not socially inspired to do business and trade with one another, we are wired right now to do everything via our colonial homes and back. I mean, you see it in transportation in terms of air travel. It's cheaper for me to fly to Washington than it is for me to fly to Lilongwe, which is 2-hour flight away from my home. We've maintained those systems for a while. So I'm really worried about this one digital market in terms of the political will outside of the talk. The political will to implement and actually get it done. What are we seeing? And the only example I have so far is that I saw a big fight for .Africa, to be granted through ICANN. And we are sitting here 5 years later, about 1.5 million websites registered in Africa, and only 61,000 .Africa. So where's this Africa pride? One Africa, one digital market, and what is there a magic bullet for how we get behind implementation? Maybe we are exhausted from the fight. It's possible that we've fought so much, we've had to fight, because everything we do, we have to fight for it. And when we come to implementation, we're just really exhausted. We are celebrating the document. How do we make sure that this does not happen with the one digital market? And I'll give you another example with the roaming, sub-regional roaming. I thought sub-regional roaming could be an easy pick for us, if we really want one digital market, can we figure out sub-regional roaming first? And we still haven't gotten that. So what's going to be the game changer here?
The questions to Danielle?
No.
Yes.
Just say M-Pesa a lot of times.
I think the question's actually for you.
I think so. So I think you're asking the right question. I think skepticism is a right thing without to approach most of the things. The reason is there's an hubris around this kind of negotiations where we pat ourselves at the back for doing a negotiation and tell ourselves the work is done. And it's not done, right? So when you see the work plan that we've designed around digital trade, one of the things we set out very clearly is there's a work to be done around negotiation, there's work to be done around adoption, there's work to be done around domestication and ratification, and there's work to be done around implementation. And they're like 4 different things. And they're just as stressful as the last, right? And I think one of the things, and she mentions, is that there's a tendency to want to get on hot topics, and what happens a lot is we do this agreement and we reward ourselves and we're like a batch, we've done it, right? Rather than counting out the rewards that come out of it. And one of the things that I think is important that I try to push a lot is to say, can we start measuring as much as quickly as possible the results and hold ourselves publicly accountable to the measurement? Because what that does is it humbles us really quickly, right? When you just want to pat yourself at the back for saying, and when you come to this kind of panel, it's great when people like Peter say things like, he is working for the entire 54 country. You're like, oh wow, great. But then you're like, how many people actually have done trade on that agreement?
Yeah.
Right? What does that mean for anybody
Yeah.
in real time? Now, the other thing to put though is some of these works are also systemic shifts that's going to take a bit of time. Even the EU agreement took a bit of time to get together, right? So some of these things are going to take.
She doesn't have time. She told you that. Impatient.
I know, I agree. So there's systemic. There's this fact that there's systemic. These things change over time, and you've got to do that. But I think the second thing, and this is where I come to the private sector, I think that what you need to happen also is, and that's where engaging private sector matters, is in the end, agreements are what they are, agreements. If nobody uses them, they're all there, agreements, right? And one of the things we need to do, and I think people like Singapore have done that really well, is create reciprocal mechanisms, right? Where you draft an agreement and you give clear incentives for private sector within that agreement. So meaning, how are we measuring the agreement and how are we saying, this is where you were on the agreement. If you do this and do this, you enjoy this benefit. If you don't, you drop off, right? And I think that's one of the things we need to get better as a continent, where we say, this agreement matters. And one of the things we're trying to do now with the digital trade protocol is to come up with a fruit basket of rewards, right, of sorts, meaning saying, you're saying you don't have capacity around this. We can support you on the capacity if you do this and this and this within the next few days, right, or next few months. And trying to create some kind of reward and incentive system within the agreement itself is one thing we're trying to do. The second thing that I think you called out very specifically is the issue around the domains and all. And I think this is also an issue of misreading the room. I don't think that, I think in a global economy, I don't think most people, and it's great to shout .Africa, but I don't think most people want to build a .Africa business.
Who wants to use it?
People want to build a .com business.
Yes. Yep.
That's just what it is. And that's one of the things where, one of those places where it's easy for policymakers to misread the room and fight for things. And it's great to have it, but like, and what I was trying to do when I picked my phone was to check how many .eus actually exist as against how many .coms. It's just what it is. Like, not a lot of American business would have a .us at the back of their like domain. It's just what it is. People want to build a .com. The promise of the internet is trade around the world, not trade just within my continent. And that matters. And that's one of the things where we're fighting we need to be careful about the battles to fight, the ones that we need to win, and actually reading the rooms and reading the right sentiments. And it's one of those things where a private sector person or a government person can care about something, but does that actually deliver real dividends? And we need to be able to start to separate between what is vanity metrics and what is actual prosperity measured by improved real lives.
Don't lose sight of the objective.
There's a lot of money on that Africa though.
We've spent lots of money on lots of white elephants. That's okay though. Don't lose sight of the objective, and people tend to. We're trying to build digital identities into these trade protocols. It doesn't really matter. I've got an identity that traverses a good number of African states when I go into the various ride-sharing platforms. They recognise me no matter where I am. We've solved much of the payments issues. The bit that we brought you in here today was to try to identify where the focus needs to be, because so much of the strength of this digital trade stuff is in the private sector. It's where a lot of the expertise is. And we've actually got to pull that out and make sure that we're framing rules around that. One of the things we're about to learn is that regulations are yesterday, even while we're going to keep demanding of our leaders to get this right. It's going to be standards driven as we move forward. I'm getting the wrap up from Luca, who's saying that my drink is finally ready. Can I get you to thank the 3 contestants? Just before we go to end comments, and I know she'll kick me afterwards, but can I also get you to thank Luca and Palm, who've done such an excellent job. And I'm going to throw it back to Mayanne.
That was a little bit abrupt. Can I get the panelists to stand and we will take a photograph while the audience stays very, very quiet and looks very awkward while we take a picture together.
Pamela,
all right.
Pamela, does Talla have a job doing this for Latin America? Can he come and now hone his skills in Latin America?
I was telling him yesterday, but because you have a digital trade agreement with New Zealand and Singapore 50 years ago.
I was distracting so you could take the pictures.
And we have not kept any action away around it, so.
Thank you very much. All right, I have the indubitable pleasure to round us all up and to help us through the entire thing. I have a QR code that is now flashed there. These are my real-time comments and my real-time notes for the entire session. So as I summarize the discussions for all of us, you can QR code and follow along with me. This will only be on the QR code will be on the screen for another couple of seconds, and then I'll get the projector to actually switch it over to the actual discussion summary. So do QR code it. Everybody good? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, can we switch it over to my session? Sorry, my document online. Oh, oops. Oh, okay. Well, you can follow along on your devices because I saw a lot of people actually clicking on it. All right, so we started along with CEO of Access Partnership, Gregory Francis, talking a little bit about the AI picture. And he really focused on this idea that there is a picture that we're moving around a journey. And our task, AI for all, AI for good, we really need to make sure that we're inclusive. And as our entire session is really around emerging economies, I think that this is a fantastic message to start us off with. We then moved on to artificial intelligence. And if you scroll right all the way down, where I have the session summary, on page, where am I? On page 3, you will see that for AI, that session, I took away the fact that we need to be humble as we talk about AI policy. We can't think that we have all the answers. We need to be inclusive. We need to grab people from not only all walks of life, but all sectors. And we need to understand that there are different journeys that people will be having and different priorities that they want to build first. So there is no one size fits all solution. The second bullet point I have there is complexity. We need to understand that this AI policy thing, and this is a technical term, this AI policy thing is actually quite hard, and traditional approaches will not solve the problems the same way. We need to do the hard things. We need to do things like figure out how to measure, monitor, and modify the policy. So agile policy development is really important. From then we moved on to the connectivity gap, or mind the connectivity gap. And my takeaways from that session are a little bit sad because I felt that the session summary was that we're not quite doing quite well. There is a gap. Connectivity continues to be a really difficult problem, especially with rural-urban divides continuing to exacerbate, and the speed of new technologies coming in, the speed of new demands on connectivity coming in are only making that divide worse. So question on existing solutions not cutting it. Where are we going with the new solutions and the new dynamics that are going to be needed? Last week when I was, again over the weekend, I was at the UN SDG Summit. They were actually talking about enabling $50 devices for everybody, and that being subsidized or actually rolled out by governments. So I think that there are people looking at universal access policies and how new ideas can be thrown up. I'm not quite sure how that's all going to be funded, but again, I think that no idea is a silly one. I think we need new ideas. Session number 3, the super controversial one, content moderation. I summarized this with, I think that there are a lot of questions that need to be unpacked for content moderation. There are lots of things in the toolbox that we can pick out, but not everything is going to be suitable for everyone at any given point in time. Different people, different groups will have different priorities at different points in time. We need to look at the policy development from a rather from a point-to-point perspective. You're not supposed to be doing a one-size-fits-all, and I think that maybe it's because we're a little bit used to perhaps an EU way of doing things. Let's harmonize things. We're grappling a little bit with the complexities of actually needing to go down to the regional and the national level. And I think that we're up for this challenge, but we need to firstly understand that let's not call too much for harmonization all at once. Let's listen to let's listen to and unpack everything in the first instance. And of course, the final digital trade panel that we've just had, the takeaways that I had were: going global and staying local. Digital trade is not a zero-sum game. We could be looking at expanding the pie for everyone. Taking away also, we need calming mechanisms for regulators. And I put a little picture for myself somewhere, like keep calm and carry on. We need not hard regulations, but principles and guidelines to tackle the thorny issues, not to immediately, jump to a solution or jump to a policy recommendation, which may not necessarily be good for everybody. Thirdly, hard to measure digital trade, but important to keep discussing and planning the innovative ideas around building trade regions. And then my favorite thing, getting countries to compete in rankings is not necessarily a bad thing, because you keep people, competing against each other. And the final point, which we didn't have a lot of time to unpack, but something which a lot of my team and I am also working on, a lot of this is actually going to be standards driven. Thank you very much for your attention. I really want to congratulate all of you for sticking with us till the end. We do have drinks for you at the can I call it the bar now? at the dining hall. So please feel free to interact with each other and really have a good evening. And I wish you all the best for the next part of your journey, whether it's away or here. Thank you.